All right, so we're going to talk about suicide assessment. So obviously this might be some heavy material. So watch at your own discretion and at your own leisure, of course, or at your own pace. So this is chapter 9. So we'll talk about the ethical implications of suicidal ideation, assessment, and response. I'm going to go a little bit fast for y'all, just to be respectful to everyone's times. But as far as looking at ethics, New Jersey Ethics Code has the following guideline. A duty to warn arises if the patient has communicated to the practitioner a threat of imminent serious physical violence against a readily identifiable individual or against himself, and the circumstances are such that a reasonable professional in the practitioner's area of expertise would believe the patient intended to carry out the threat, or the circumstances are such that a reasonable professional in the practitioner's area of expertise would believe that the patient intended to carry out an act of imminent serious physical violence against a readily identifiable individual or against himself. The duty is discharged by arranging hospitalization and voluntary commitment, advising law enforcement of the identity of the intended victim, warning the victim or their parent or guardian if the patient is threat to self-inflicted violence. So that's a very long paragraph to say that we as clinicians have to warn the following parties: law enforcement, the victim, and victim's family, if the patient's a threat of harm to self, because that is our duty as our ethical responsibility as therapists and psychologists. So suicidal ideation can obviously be emotional, even for those we do not know personally. Specifically, I used to get pretty emotional thinking about Chester Bennington, the lead singer of Linkin Park and partial singer of Stone Temple Pilots for a little bit. There's a video game streamer named Etika, a Super Smash Bros. Player, that I also was emotional. He actually filmed himself walking to the bridge where he then ended his life. And on the walk to the bridge, he just talked about some of his struggles with depression. Robin Williams, Avicii, Kate Spade, and so many other people. So discussing it both here and in an actual clinical setting may be even more poignant if you have a personal connection to it. My personal connection can lead to difficulty breathing due to sadness if I'm not careful. That's my own. I have a family member who's experienced bouts of suicidal ideation, and I can feel deep sadness and pressure on my chest whenever I think about it. So approximately 30,000 deaths each year are due to suicide between the years 1990 to 2004, and we think those rates are steadily inclining. So this rate has declined through most of the 90s. However, it's increasing since 2012. There's been a sharp increase in youth suicide, in particular for girls about 10 to 13 years old. Some of the geeky research I've seen says people born in year 1995 and later, which I assume is probably a majority of y'all. Sorry, we'll let a dog out. Go, go, go. Majority of y'all are probably in that cohort of people born in 1995 or later. But there's some theory that that's when social media became kind of ingrained in little girls' lives when they're in middle school. And there's something about getting social media in middle school that makes it particularly difficult and gives us an increased chance of depression and anxiety, again, especially for little girls. One of my favorite guy, John Haidt, he does a lot of research towards the impact of social media on young people's health. So if you're more interested, look up his body of work. And so attempts at NSSI, which means non-suicidal self-injury, occur more frequently than completion. And women attempt more frequently, men complete more frequently. So women will attempt but not complete suicide more frequently. And that's typically because men use more lethal means, like typically guns, firearms. Women will use pills, and regularly they can get their stomach pumped, or it's a pill that's not actually deadly, but it does put you into renal failure, you get rushed to the hospital and that sort of thing. So this is a clip from the Association for Suicide Prevention, the AFSP.org, as you can see at the bottom left and bottom right. New Jersey is actually the best state in the country for suicide as far as, man, that's a weird way to say that, but New Jersey is the best state in the country as far as the rate per 100,000 people people that complete suicide. So it's the least common in Jersey compared to other states. So as you can see, the number of suicide deaths, the rate per 100,000, and again, our state rank is 50, and 50 is good in that regard. Fun side fact, New Jersey is number 1 in the country, number 2 in the country for public education, and also like number 48, 49 in taxes, and they're probably pretty directly correlated. High taxes means a lot of money goes to like schools. But anyways, you can see some stats and info here about how New Jersey specifically does on these things. And so to assess for suicidal ideation, there are a couple things to look for, like depression and mood, obviously, and then a couple demographic things to consider. So sex, age, race, religion, seasonal variation of mood. As I said earlier, men complete, women attempt more often. Native American and Alaskan Native people have the highest racial group of people that attempt and complete suicide. Geographically, it's most frequent in the Southwest and worldwide in the springtime. I'm not entirely sure why worldwide springtime is what the data says, but that's the information I'm privy to. With regards to Native American, Alaska Native populations, as the last slide said, we are the best state in the country as far as having the lowest suicide to population ratio. Alaska was number 2, and then like Oklahoma was like number 4, I believe, and New Mexico was number 9. So again, there's a very high incidence of suicide for Native American, Alaska Native people. So other things to assess for would be social isolation. Joyner, I forget his first name, theories that we as people possess the need to belong and contribute to the welfare of others, thus without it we turn to suicide. So there's a huge social component. That's to kind of take it a step further, that most suicide would be prevented with really good social connection. And then there's physical health concerns as well. If somebody's in a lot of chronic pain, frequently getting surgery, altered body functions, and a terminal diagnosis, be an increased likelihood for suicidal ideation. And then personal resources, when basic needs are not met, adequate healthcare is not provided, there's no meaningful activities to pursue, the relationships with others are bad, and there's any significant loss, all this stuff increases somebody's likelihood to consider or attempt suicide. And so whenever you're in a session, keep these things in mind. So furthermore, substance use, mental and psychiatric health, like we talked about, and SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and antidepressants, can be helpful for the treatment, though there is some debate that SSRIs actually increase suicidal ideation, and that is people who are deeply depressed might not have the energy to carry out a plan, but if you're a little less depressed but still extremely depressed but have enough energy to then carry out the plan, that's where SSRIs might be functional to get somebody from like too depressed to get out of bed but very depressed, and then very, very depressed but able to get out of bed and then carry out their attempt at suicide. So if you're working with somebody who has SSRIs prescribed to them, be extremely cautious in the beginning of the treatment recommendation, the medication prescription recommendations, lest they should attempt suicide if their mood improves a little bit. Sexual orientation, sexual minorities typically attempt and complete suicide a little bit more frequently, presumably as a function of prejudice, bias, history of like terrible treatment, and those sorts of things. Trauma and abuse history, and then previous attempts. So this is the comprehensive checklist that the book provides. I think it's really good to read through, but admittedly, like you're probably not going to keep all this stuff at the forefront of your mind when you're meeting with somebody who you're concerned about suicidality with. And then a little bit more towards assessment. So you want to assess current mental status through thoughts, plan, intent, and then suicide contract. I think this is what you should keep in mind if you're meeting with somebody who's indicated some suicidality. Thought, plan, and intent. So suicide contracts are not actually effective at stopping suicide. The book recommends them, but I honestly think they're a little bit shaming, a little bit weird and guilt-inducing to have a client like sign on a dotted line that no, I'm not going to end my life until after next session at least, or something like that. I think they send the wrong message. This would be a time in class where I would ask for y'all's input and feedback, but again, unfortunately, we're not together. But I'm not a huge fan of suicide contracts. The only thing they're good for is covering your ass as a clinician, and anything that's just a CYA, I think, is insincere and disingenuous, personally. So CAM's a collaborative assessment in management of suicidality. There's an example of it on the next page. It's a little bit better. It talks about the emphasis of trust and alliance between the clinician and the client. And then also consider iatrogenic harm. So iatrogenic means harm done by the supposed cure. So if there's surgery to get your appendix removed, but while cutting you open, there's some accident and they poke a hole in your bladder, that is iatrogenic harm, that the cure caused some unforeseen and unintentional harm. So there could be iatrogenic harm that you could remind somebody how bad their life has been, talking about childhood history, childhood trauma, so be careful of that as well. This is the CAMS, that again talks about suicidality and assessing the severity for somebody and the likelihood that they will attempt to end their lives. And so as you can see, it talks a little bit more about the actual thoughts and feelings that the person has, and the further pages talk a little bit more about their relationship with their therapist. So ACT and DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, start with the assumptions that suicidal thoughts and depression are natural responses to human suffering and other contextual factors. Two contexts in which suicidal ideation grows: overwhelming pain and overwhelming lack of hope. So that is ACT specific. So whenever I'm talking to somebody that is indicated suicidal ideation, I typically steer conversation towards pain and then hope or meaning. Like, do you suspect that this will get better, and how is the pain experience for that person? So again, if I were to distill all of suicide assessment down to two things, say talk about pain and talk about hope. So CBT has a different view. They have what's called the negative triangle, so negative views about the world, negative views about yourself, negative view about the future. When those three things are very, very true, people are likely to attempt suicide or complete suicide. So whenever you're asking about suicidal ideation, be direct and clear, be calm and professional, yet caring and human. How often, I use these phrases: how often does your brain give you the thought that you want to be dead? How often does your brain think that things would be better if you ended your life? Again, you can notice that language is very ACT influenced. Like, how often does your brain give you this thought? How often does your brain think this? Because ultimately, I do believe it's not that the person is deeply thinking these things, it's a thought their brain is giving them. And I think I accidentally skipped this slide, but it talks a little bit more that most people don't exactly want to kill themselves. It's more that they just want their pain to end. They want their experience to change. And so again, I think when you're in an overwhelming amount of pain with an overwhelming amount of hopelessness, it makes sense that your brain gives you the thought that you'd rather be dead. Again, I really wish we were meeting in person. Obviously, this is a heavy topic, but I would be fascinated by y'all's thoughts and input on some of these points in conversation and any of y'all's experiences in any of these domains. But anyways, this also would be questions I would ask y'all. I would love to get y'all's input and feedback if we are all in person together, so I'll just give you my answers. But when asking about a plan, consider what words you use to ask with someone who's indicated ideation. I ask very specifically, like, do you have a specific plan about where, when, and how that you intend to end your life? If they answer those questions, then I ask, what means, I guess that's how they would end their life. And you have to judge the lethality of their attempt. I had a professor talk about having a client who intended to end their lives by putting a blanket under the door in their bedroom and then filling the room with a few plants. They thought that they would eventually die of carbon dioxide poisoning because they would be breathing all the oxygen in and then giving it to the plant. Their room would not be sealed tight, so there's like no lethality in the plan. But brings up another question of like cognitive capacity. If somebody thinks that they will be able to end their life by putting being in a room with a plant, but it's very interesting. Like, that's why it's important to consider lethality. At the very least, makes it go from like a very severe and intense session to like less severe and less intense if the lethality is low. And then access to the means, and then also you're going to ask about proximity to support and resources like friends, family, or other things that are meaningful. So towards intervention, if they clearly identify a desire, ideation, and plan, it means you have to break confidentiality. You tell the parents if they're a minor, arrange for them to be admitted to a psychiatric unit of a general hospital or short-term care facility. You tell local law enforcement of the person's threat and identity of the victim or client, even if it's the victim or client themselves. So if you are not past the duty to warn threshold, in other words, they indicate suicidal ideation but no specific plan or lethality, Be empathic and supportive, of course. Panic on the inside if you must, but not on the outside. Identify coping strategies and alternatives to suicide. And this is what I was saying earlier. Separate pain from self. Again, most people probably don't want to die. They just want their pain to abate, to change. They want their experience to change. If ultimately a client ends their life, seek support, professional consultation, do a psychological autopsy or a postmortem, if you will, kind of look back and reflect on what maybe you could have done differently in the therapy case with that person. Get some emotional support for yourself, get your own therapist if you need, contact an attorney to protect yourself, and go through all the documentation that you have with your attorney. Be available to the family unless recommended otherwise, and so brings up a good question towards confidentiality. If a family member wants to know a little bit more about your therapy sessions after their loved one has passed away, do you divulge that information? Ultimately, no, unless there was a release of information on file. So I wouldn't divulge anything that the client said to me behind the therapy room, and especially if the client's like, oh man, I'm ending my life because my mom is an asshole, and then mom asks you, hey, what can you tell me? You obviously don't want to make the situation worse for that parent. Document everything. Document that you conducted a risk assessment. Document that you consulted with colleagues. You implemented these suicide interventions. So document everything. So again, guys, I wish we were in person for these conversations, but I appreciate you being here. So one more video to go, and it's a short one.